Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The clouds often gathered over Grayville without promise of rain, much like the people who gathered around Dick, drawn to his warmth, but never staying to shelter him when his own sky darkened. In that dusty town where the houses were as humble as their owners and secrets clung to walls like peeling paint, Dick lived in a modest bungalow near the market square. His compound was small, fenced by rusted sheets and wild bougainvillea vines, yet wide enough for anyone in need to find a place to breathe. He was the kind of man whose kindness didn't ring loud like brass cymbals, but rather hummed quietly through his actions, the kind that made a woman leave with a full stomach even if Dick's own ribs sang from hunger. They said he could trade his last kobo for your comfort, and if you wept near him, he'd carry your grief like it was furniture he'd built himself. And truly, he did build things, tables, beds, wardrobes, carving life into plain wood with hands calloused by work and worn thin by generosity. Yet despite all he gave, the pot of gratitude rarely boiled on his behalf. His brothers, Josh and Leonard, had arrived at his doorstep years ago after their parents' untimely death in an accident that crushed more than bones. It splintered their future. Dick, barely making ends meet as it was, welcomed them with the arms of a man who had learned that family isn't a matter of comfort, but of duty, even when it wrings your soul dry. They were still boys then, scrawny and fragile, with silence where laughter should have lived. Dick clothed them, fed them, taught them how to grip a hammer and respect a plank, and when other men mocked him for raising children that weren't his responsibility, he simply smiled and said, "If I leave them to the world will leave them to the wolves." But even wolves know who to fear. And what Dick didn't know was that not all bread feeds loyalty. Sometimes it only whets the appetite for betrayal. On market days, Dick rose before the cock crowed and hummed as he worked, like someone who had learned to plant joy in the soil of routine. His shop stood between a broken tailoring kiosk and an old cobbler's bench, nothing fancy, just a square of cement floor, corrugated iron roof, and planks stacked like soldiers awaiting command. It was there he created beauty from the brittle, furniture that bore his quiet patience in every groove. His tools were few but loyal, chisels with wooden handles smoothed by years of grip, a mallet that had outlived 2 workbenches, and a measuring tape so tattered it looked like it had survived war. Children loved to watch him work, marveling at how the man with the tired eyes and cracked nails could turn splinters into softness. Sometimes, when a child hovered too close, he'd pause and hand over a block of wood, whispering, "The world won't hand you everything, but carve what you can with what you've got." His words, like his hands, were firm but kind. But behind that kindness was a hunger, one not for food, but for faith. He believed people could change, that time was a sculptor and pain its blade, and if you gave enough of yourself, the ones you loved would be sharpened into better versions of themselves. Josh, now grown, had started frequenting the motor park, hanging around men who wore loud shirts and louder lies. Leonard spent most evenings glued to his phone, whispering to some girl from out of town about dreams too big for Grayville. Dick never stopped him. He thought freedom was part of growth, and that love was like water. It finds its level. But what he didn't know was that water, when ungrateful, can still drown the man who carried the jug. The first time Dick noticed something was missing, it was subtle. One of his handcrafted stools, an ashwood piece with carvings shaped like dancing flames, was gone from the display, but he assumed he'd sold it and forgotten. The second time, he wasn't so forgiving. His old toolbox, gifted by his father before the grave claimed him, had vanished. When he asked Leonard, the boy shrugged and mumbled something about borrowing it. The words felt like sawdust in Dick's mouth. Dry, tasteless, hard to swallow. But he let it go. He'd let so much go over the years that, perhaps unknowingly, He trained them to see his silence as weakness. The final straw came when he overheard Josh at the junction, bragging to someone about having a fool for a brother who'd sign anything with his eyes closed. Dick froze in place, his breath caught between disbelief and sorrow. He didn't confront him. Instead, he walked home that evening beneath a sky smeared with the kind of purple that warned of rain, but brought none. At the door, Grace, a widow whose son he once fed for a year without charge, had left a loaf of bread and a note that read, "You are not invisible." He smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had learned the ache of being seen only when broken. That night, as thunder rolled in the distance but never reached the roof, Dick sat beside his kerosene lamp, staring at the blank receipt book on his table. The page was empty, but in his heart, names were being crossed out. Despite all this, Dick kept waking before dawn, as if loyalty to his craft could anchor his life in place. On one such morning, he took out a slab of oak he'd saved for a special project, a headboard meant for his future, one he imagined sharing with someone who would understand that love isn't in what you say, but in what you endure quietly. He sanded the surface, carving curves as soft as hope, until sweat glistened on his forehead like dew on an iron roof. But as he worked, he heard voices outside. Josh had returned, standing by the fence, arms crossed like a judge, face unreadable. Beside him, Leonard wore a pressed shirt Dick had never seen. "We need to talk," Josh said. Dick, still holding the chisel, simply nodded and led them in. What followed was a request dressed as brotherhood. A real estate developer was offering to buy their late father's land on the town's edge, the one with mango trees that still bore fruit like memory refusing to die. They needed Dick's signature to seal the deal, and promised it was only procedural. They'd share the payment evenly. Dick's heart swayed like a hammock in a storm. He didn't want to sell it, but he didn't want to be the hand that held back their wings. So he signed. With that pen stroke, he handed over the roots of his beginnings, unaware he'd just clipped his own branches. His signature was neat, but what followed would be anything but. The morning after he signed the papers, Dick woke with a strange hollowness clinging to his chest, as if his body knew something his heart had yet to admit. The sun filtered gently through his faded curtains, casting thin gold lines across the wall like some divine artist attempting to decorate grief. He folded his blanket with mechanical grace, his movements slow and practiced like a man trying to keep rhythm in a world slowly tilting off balance. At the edge of his bed, he sat for a long while, palms cupped like he was trying to catch something invisible, a whisper, perhaps, from his late father's spirit or a trace of peace he couldn't name. He cooked a small pot of yam porridge, enough to feed 3, as he always did. The table felt wider than usual, and the silence between the chairs thickened like cold pap. Josh and Leonard had gone out early, or perhaps hadn't come home at all. It was becoming harder to tell the difference. When Dick stepped into his workshop, the weight of air felt different, heavier, as though the wind had begun mourning something he hadn't yet buried. He picked up a plank and tried to sketch out a bookshelf design he'd promised to Mr. Adelaja, the retired headmaster, but the lines wouldn't stay straight. His hands, once sure as the sun's rise, trembled slightly. There was no noise, no drama, just the quiet shift of a man beginning to sense that he had opened a door he might never close again. As the morning wore on, word began to reach him in trickles. Grace mentioned seeing surveyors on the old family land. Later, Nini the tailor said she overheard someone at the mechanic's joint discussing cement prices for the same plot. Dick brushed it off, but with every nail he hammered, doubt echoed louder. It was as though something had been sold from under his feet while he stood smiling at the transaction. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that felt like time was stretching itself just to punish the living, that the truth walked into Dick's compound, wearing a tie and holding a brown envelope. The man whose cologne announced him before his words did introduced himself as Timmy O'Cone, legal representative of Lushwood Properties Limited. He handed Dick the envelope with a firm nod and said, "Final notice to vacate the premises, sir." Demolition begins in 10 days. The words hit like wet cloth to the face, quiet but suffocating. Dick blinked once, then again, as if the page would morph into something else if he just stared hard enough. But the ink held its shape. "There's been a mistake," he murmured, voice fraying at the edges. Timmy smiled like someone who had delivered such heartbreaks before breakfast and replied, "If you have any concerns, kindly direct them to the numbers at the bottom. Have a blessed day." And with that, he left. The envelope hung in Dick's hand like a dead fish, heavy and useless. He stood by the gate looking down the road, half expecting his brothers to appear laughing, saying it was all a prank. But evening fell, and with it came truth. When Josh finally returned later that night, his face wore the smugness of someone convinced he'd done what needed to be done. "It's not personal, Dick," he said, peeling an orange like the juice in his mouth was sweeter than the taste of betrayal. "It's just life. We needed the money. You wouldn't have let it go if we told you outright." Leonard didn't come home at all. Dick didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply sat on the wooden bench beside the hibiscus shrub their mother once planted, hands clasped, as if holding the last remnants of belief. The night wind hummed through the compound like an old hymn sung by someone losing faith with every verse. In the days that followed, Dick packed in silence. He folded years into boxes, wood shavings that still smelt of dreams, photograph frames with dust thick enough to hold thumbprints of memories long erased, clothes he hadn't worn in years but couldn't bring himself to throw away. A few neighbors came around, their footsteps timid, their condolences wrapped in awkward silences. Some said it's well, while others offered the more painful, "You too kind, now why don't take advantage?" Grace brought food he couldn't eat and prayers he couldn't say amen to. The house grew emptier by the hour, but the ache expanded. One evening he found an old notebook tucked under his bed, where he'd written scripture verses during lonely seasons. One page read, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for after many days you will find it again." He stared at it for minutes that felt like hours. What if the water swallowed it? What if it never returned? When the developers finally arrived, with machines growling like angry beasts, Dick stood at a distance. The structure crumbled with the first blow. His father's mango tree, chopped down without ceremony, the workshop roof torn like paper. As the dust rose, so did the tears, burning hot behind his eyes. Not a single brother stood beside him. Not one apology came. Dick turned and walked away, each step feeling like he was leaving behind not just wood and walls, but years he could never rewrite. He didn't know where to go. He just knew he couldn't stay where love had once lived, but no longer knew his name. He wandered, not with the madness of a man lost, but with the deliberate silence of someone choosing to disappear. Grace found him 2 days later, sitting outside the community center, barefoot, with nothing but his tool satchel beside him. She didn't ask questions. She just sat beside him, unwrapped a loaf of bread, and said, "You gave, Dick, and giving never goes unrewarded." Not always in the way we expect, but it circles back. He didn't reply, but something in his shoulders softened. She took him home, not his old home, but her home, a 2-room flat behind the bakery. There, for the first time in weeks, he slept. Not deeply, not peacefully, but without flinching. Over the next few days, she gave him space. Sometimes he sat on the back porch carving spoons out of leftover wood. Other times he simply stared at the sunset like it owed him answers. He never spoke about Josh or Leonard. When children passed by, he handed them small carvings, fish, stars, even tiny drums. They'd smile and run off, unaware that the man giving them joy had forgotten what it felt like himself. But slowly, like dew forming after a long drought, the spirit in Dick began to shift. The egg didn't vanish, but he stopped feeding it. One evening, Grace brought him a plank and said, "Make me a stool for my kitchen." It wasn't the project that moved him, but the trust. That night, Beneath a low bulb and the gentle hum of a kerosene lamp, Dick picked up his chisel once more. And though his hand still trembled, the wood welcomed him back like an old friend. The months that followed were neither cruel nor kind. They simply passed like leaves riding a breeze, with no memory of the branch they once clung to. Dick now lived in the back room of Grace's house, where the window faced a quiet alley, and the air smelt of old bread and morning dew. He did not return to his former street, nor did he ask after the land, the house, or the brothers who carved a wound so deep it echoed in his dreams. Instead, he spent his mornings on Grace's veranda, mending old stools or fashioning new ones out of leftover planks she collected from the carpenter's yard. His hands remembered what his heart tried to forget. Neighbors began to drop by, not out of pity, but with quiet respect, as though they'd heard whispers of a man who was broken, but still building. A teacher from the nearby public school asked if Dick could make blackboard frames for the junior class. A nurse requested a bench for her waiting room. And so, without meaning to, Dick became known again, not as the man who lost everything, but the man who made something out of splinters. He spoke little, smiled less, but never turned anyone away. Yet every time he reached for his tools, he felt the memory of his father's shed, the laughter that once bounced between wooden walls, and the voice of Josh saying, "It's just life." He didn't curse them. That would have been too easy. Instead, he carved, and with every groove, he buried another piece of pain in the grain. It was Grace who first noticed the boy. He came often, barefoot, thin as a matchstick, hanging around the alley behind her compound. At first she thought he was a petty thief, but something about his eyes told a different story, eyes that had seen too much too soon, the kind that carried hunger not just for food, but for refuge. One evening, when the bread oven was still warm and the smell of fresh rolls drifted through the mesh door, Grace stepped outside and handed the boy a piece. He snatched it with the swiftness of a street child, but then paused, muttered "thank you," and ran. Days passed, and he returned, never speaking, always watching. Dick noticed him too, watching from his stool, chisel in hand. It reminded him of another pair of eyes long ago, Leonard's, back when he still listened, before pride found its roots. One afternoon, as the sky began to paint itself in gold and gray, Dick set a block of wood and a carving knife on the porch railing. He said nothing, just nodded. The boy stared at it like a test, then slowly stepped forward, picked it up, and sat cross-legged near the door. That was how Micah came into Dick's life, not with drama, but like rainfall in Harmattan, unexpected, quiet, and healing. He never asked the boy where he came from. The streets had 1,000 stories, and not all needed retelling. What mattered was that Micah watched, learned, and began to mirror the rhythm of Dick's hands. Soon he could shape an edge, smooth a surface, even fix a crooked stool leg. Grace started calling them the quiet twins, one weathered by life, the other still being tempered by it. In the hush between them, something began to grow, not quite hope, but its first cousin. One night, as thunder rolled lazily across the sky and rain whispered against the roof like an old woman telling secrets to her pots, Grace found Dick sitting alone, a wooden olive branch resting in his lap. He had carved it from mahogany, polished it with oil, and wrapped the base with twine. "It's for Josh," he said simply, as though the name didn't taste like betrayal. Grace blinked, surprised. "You want to send him that?" Dick nodded. "Micah's going to visit a friend in River Lane. That's where Josh is now, scraping through some kind of job. Word gets around." Grace didn't argue. She'd learned by now that Dick's forgiveness wasn't the kind sung from rooftops. It was the type born in stillness, carried out with hands, not lips. "You don't owe him anything," she whispered. Dick smiled faintly, the kind of smile that grew from scars, not joy. "That's true," he said, "but I owe myself peace, and I can't build it on bitterness." So he packed the olive branch into a small box, alongside a letter that simply read, I forgive you. I hope you find what you couldn't see in me." When Micah left the next morning, the box was in his backpack. Dick watched him disappear down the misty street, and for the first time in months, his shoulders looked lighter. It didn't erase the hurt, but it reminded him he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Forgiveness, after all, was not about forgetting. It was about unclenching a fist you'd held too long against your own chest. As Micah traveled, the workshop behind Grace's house flourished. Word of Dick's quiet skill reached neighboring districts, and orders began to trickle in. Not large ones, just chairs, shelves, cabinets, but enough to fill his days and stretch his nights. He taught Micah how to read measurements, how to listen to wood, how to feel where a crack might appear before it ever surfaced. Their bond deepened not through conversations, but through shared silences that said more than noise ever could. Grace often watched them through the kitchen window, her hands dusted with flour, her heart both heavy and full. She had once lost a husband to the kind of hardship that carved men into shadows, but in Dick and Micah she saw something reassembled, like two broken vessels mended together to carry new water. On Sundays, they no longer stayed indoors. Dick walked with Micah to the open field by the old church, where children played with kites stitched from old newspapers. He'd sit under a tree, nodding at passers-by who used to pity him but now simply respected his silence. Micah would carve toy birds for the smaller kids, teaching them how to shape wings out of waste. Some called it charity. Others said Dick was rebuilding his heart plank by plank. But to Dick, it wasn't about recovery. It was about choosing what to keep carrying. And in a world that had taken so much from him, he decided to carry only what gave him peace. A chisel, a block of wood, and a boy who reminded him that not all seeds fall on rocks. The rain came with no warning that evening, one of those sudden Grayville downpours that emptied the sky like a grudge finally released. Dick had just closed up the back door of the shed when the first drop slapped the zinc roof, loud as spilled secrets. Inside, the scent of varnish still hung in the air from the cabinet Micah had polished that afternoon. Dick didn't mind the storm. He'd grown used to nature's unpredictable moods, how the wind sometimes whispered and sometimes wailed. He pulled a stool close to the doorway, watching the rain sheet the alley in silver, while the faint hum of Grace humming a hymn drifted from the kitchen. The moment was peaceful, yet something beneath it stirred unease, like dust rising from an unseen crack. He remembered days like this from his old house, how the rain would fall and his brothers would argue over whose turn it was to fetch firewood. Those memories were brittle now, like old sandals left too long in the sun. He didn't touch them often, but when they came, they sat heavy on his shoulders. The letter Micah had delivered to Josh was still unanswered, and though Dick told himself he didn't expect a reply, some part of him still watched the door like it owed him closure. But nothing came. No knock, no note, just the steady presence of the rain, beating against the roof as though echoing the persistence of a past that refused to be swept away. Days turned into weeks, and Dick poured himself into work with the kind of silent focus usually found in monks and men who've tasted too much sorrow to waste time talking about it. His carvings became finer, more intricate, wood transformed not just by skill, but by grief softened into grace. Grace herself had begun referring new clients from the women's fellowship at church, and one of them, an older widow named Mama Reese, commissioned a full dining set, a job that would take over a month. Dick accepted it not for the money, but for the space it gave him to think, to shape thoughts in the same rhythm he shaped timber. Micah grew too, in both height and hand. He could now complete simple pieces from start to finish without supervision. One afternoon, Dick stood in the doorway, watching the boy guide a blade through a knotty plank, and he saw something there. Focus, yes, but also peace, the kind that doesn't come from comfort, but from purpose. Grace later remarked, half laughing, "You've turned that child into a small old man," and Dick smiled. It wasn't why, but it was real. Still, there were nights the weight returned. Nights when the shadows in the alley looked like memories crouching, waiting to pounce. On one such night, Micah found him outside, eyes locked on the moon, like it held all the answers he'd never received. Without saying a word, the boy sat beside him, handed him a half-carved fish, and whispered, "Want to help me finish it?" And just like that, the darkness loosened its grip. Not entirely, but enough for breath to pass freely again. Then came the call. It was Grace who answered, her voice carrying from the kitchen with a sharpness that made Dick look up. She entered the shed slowly, holding her phone like it was a verdict. "It's Leonard," she said, eyes uncertain. Dick took the phone with hands that had steadied 1,000 planks, but trembled now like leaves on water. Leonard's voice was rough, aged, weary, cracked with regrets too dry to cry over. He didn't start with greetings. He simply said, "Josh is in the hospital. Heart complications. They say he's not doing well. He's been asking to see you." Silence fell like dusk between them. Dick leaned against the bench, the wood cooled beneath his palms. Leonard added, "I know we did wrong, Dick. I know we don't deserve it. But if you can come, come." When the line went dead, Grace didn't speak. She just placed a cup of water near him and left. For a long while, Dick didn't move. His breath was shallow, the way it gets when the past comes knocking with a new face. He thought of the land, the house, the workshop, the way Josh had peeled an orange that day and peeled his heart in the same breath. He thought of the letter, the olive branch, the silence, and still he didn't feel anger. Just a sadness too deep for rage. When he finally stood, it was with the steadiness of a man who knew the storm could rise again, but had already learned how to stand inside it without being swept away. The next morning, before sunrise had fully stretched its fingers across the roofs of Grayville, Dick packed a small satchel, just a clean shirt, some money Grace pressed into his palm, and the wooden dove Micah had carved 2 weeks earlier. "Give it to him," the boy said. "He might not say thank you, but maybe his heart will." Dick didn't reply, but he reached out and touched Micah's shoulder gently, a gesture full of weight. The journey to River Lane was quiet. The roads were long and mostly empty, lined with rusted signboards and tired trees that leaned like eavesdropping elders. At the hospital, the nurse recognized Josh's name and led Dick to a room that smelled of antiseptic and things left unsaid. Josh lay there, thinner than Dick remembered, his face drawn, the brashness gone like smoke after rain. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment there was no past, just 2 brothers, one breathing, the other breaking. "You came," Josh said. It wasn't a question, just a fragile marvel. Dick nodded, sat beside him, and placed the wooden dove on the bedside table. "Micah made it," he murmured. "Said your heart might still have space for flight." Josh closed his eyes, tears leaking from corners he could no longer control. "I didn't know how to say sorry," he whispered. I thought if I stayed gone, it would hurt less." Dick looked at him long and slow. "Sometimes staying is the only apology that matters," he said. "They didn't hug. They didn't weep together. But when Dick left that room hours later, something unspoken had shifted. The door didn't close with a slam. It creaked shut like a wound stitched just enough to stop the bleeding." When Dick returned to Grayville, the air had changed in ways no one else seemed to notice. The sky still stretched gray and generous, and the scent of baked bread from Grace's oven still lingered on the breeze, but something inside him had shifted, quietly, like a curtain drawn on a season long overstayed. He stepped back into the compound with the gait of a man who had laid something heavy at the feet of time and chosen not to pick it up again. Grace met him with a silence that didn't press for stories, only handed him a warm bowl of yam and a flask of tea, then turned back to her kneading. Micah, however, watched him differently. Not with curiosity, but a tenderness that only a child who had once been broken could recognize in another. Dick ate slowly, savoring each bite not for the taste, but for the ordinariness of it. How peace often arrived dressed in plain cloth and the echo of wooden spoons against enamel plates. Later that evening, he sat outside, staring at the sky as if trying to carve sense into the clouds. The wooden dove he'd brought back from River Lane now rested on the porch, and though Josh had not asked him to stay, Dick left it anyway. Not because it would fix anything, but because some symbols do more speaking in silence than words ever could. He told no one what passed between them. He didn't need to. The fact that he returned with a face not carved by grief was enough. Micah noticed it first, the way Dick now lingered longer over the details of his craft, how his laugh, when it came, sounded less like a cracked calabash and more like something still capable of holding water. With the weight of that chapter behind him, Dick turned his attention to the living. His workshop, once a small shaded spot behind Grace's compound, had grown into a hive of gentle rhythm. Clients no longer came merely out of sympathy. They came for quality, for patience, for that unmistakable touch that made every chair feel like it had been built with a prayer inside it. Micah now had his own corner of the workspace, where smaller projects came to life beneath his steady hands. The boy had grown into the tools like they were part of his skin, and Dick watched him with the quiet pride of a farmer whose fields had once failed but now blossomed with second chances. Word spread beyond Grayville. A small vocational center from a nearby town wrote to ask if Dick could run a workshop for youth who had dropped out of school. At first, he hesitated. The idea of teaching beyond his small shed felt like standing on a bridge he wasn't sure would hold. But it was Grace who said, one evening as they shelled groundnuts beneath a lamp, "You've been pouring into planks for years. Maybe it's time to pour into people." The words, simple as they were, lit something inside him. He agreed. On the first day of the workshop, a group of boys and girls sat in front of him, some curious, some hardened by life, others just quietly desperate for something that looked like hope. Dick didn't start with rules. He handed each one a piece of wood and said, "This is your story. Don't be afraid to shape it, even if your hands are shaking." It was the only lesson he gave that day, and it was the one they remembered most. Not all days were filled with purpose. Some were simply long and plain, marked by the sound of nails and hammers, of sawdust rising and footsteps fading. On those days, Dick sometimes wandered into the town's quiet corners, the old railway track that hadn't seen a train in 10 years, the edge of the river where reeds grew wild and memories crept like ants under skin. One afternoon, while sitting beneath a mango tree by the edge of the market, he saw a man struggling to push a cart up the hill. The man was older now, heavier in the face, his clothes cleaner than memory would have dressed him, but it was Leonard. Their eyes met. Leonard paused, his hands on the cart handle, unsure whether to keep pushing or turn and run. Dick stood slowly, walked toward him, not with anger, not with bitterness, just with that same unshaken stillness that had carried him through loss and betrayal alike. Leonard mumbled something, an apology perhaps, or an excuse, but Dick only helped steady the cart and said, "You all right?" Leonard nodded, ashamed. They stood for a moment, neither man filling the silence. Then Dick handed him a sachet of water from his bag and added, "It's a hot day. Rest a while." He didn't ask where Leonard lived now. He didn't offer his home. He just offered water. Sometimes, mercy doesn't need to rebuild bridges. It just needs to let people cross rivers on their own. Back at the shed, life moved forward like the hands of a slow clock, steady, unfazed by past alarms. Dick continued to craft not only furniture, but space. Space for Micah to dream. Space for broken youth to learn that failure was not the end of usefulness. His designs now bore names: rest chair, second sun table, olive shelf, each one a tribute to moments that nearly undid him, now immortalized in wood. Grace would sometimes step in, placing fresh bread or bowls of soup on the workbench, her only complaint being, "You've turned this place into a kitchen for souls." And perhaps she wasn't wrong. For each nail Dick drove, each edge he sanded, was a silent sermon to those who had forgotten what care looked like. On Micah's birthday, Dick built him a chest with compartments for tools, each drawer labeled with a single word: patience, trust, skill, forgiveness. And at the very bottom, a compartment simply marked you. The boy opened it and found nothing inside. "Why is it empty?" he asked, eyes curious. Dick looked at him and replied, "Because it's for whatever you become that I haven't seen yet." In that moment, Micah smiled in a way that could mend glass. The past had not disappeared. Its scars still shaped the corners of Dick's eyes, the angle of his shoulders, the way he sometimes stared at nothing and everything. But he had made peace with it, not by forgetting, but by carving new meaning into it. And in the stillness of those days, when the tools rested and the wood sighed beneath soft hands, Dick finally understood. What he had given the world had not vanished. It had simply taken longer to return home. The day began like any other, with the sun stretching over Grayville in soft streaks of gold and dust. But there was something different about the way the morning air moved, like a whisper between seasons, a hush that came before a door opened or a chapter ended. Dick stood barefoot on the veranda, a mug of lukewarm tea in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. It wasn't a letter this time, or a contract, or even a note from Grace reminding him to buy charcoal. It was an invitation, a formal one, printed on cream-colored cardstock with bold, careful letters: Grayville Artisan Recognition Ceremony, honoring community builders. His name was there, clear as daylight. Not Dick the man they pitied, or Dick the one whose brothers took everything, but Richard O'Whirl, master craftsman, mentor, and builder of futures. For a moment, the cup trembled in his hand, not from nerves, but from the weight of being seen. Truly seen. He had spent so long working in corners, carving meaning into wood and silence into strength, that he forgot what it felt like for the light to point toward him without judgment. He showed the card to Grace, who clapped her flower-covered hands together and said, "About time the world clapped for the man who never stopped working, even when his world fell apart." Micah looked up from polishing a small jewelry box and grinned. "You'll wear your brown native, right? The one that makes you look like an elder that knows secrets." Dick chuckled, setting the cup down. "I might," he replied. But what he didn't say was that part of him still flinched at recognition, at attention, at praise. Not because he didn't want it, but because he had learned, too deeply, that not all eyes that look upon you do so with love. The ceremony was held in the town square beneath the old almond trees, where elders once told folk tales that made children giggle and grown men weep. Chairs were arranged in a circle, simple yet dignified, with handmade garlands hanging from wooden beams. The crowd was not large, but it was made of the right people, the kind that remembered the details others forgot. The mayor, a modest man with a walking stick carved by Dick himself years ago, stood up to speak. His words were careful, deliberate, like chisels forming a name into stone. He spoke of resilience, of service, of choosing to give even when the world chooses to take. "Some men build monuments," he said, "but this man built people." There was applause, not the thunderous kind that sweeps through stadiums, but the kind that rises slowly, sincerely, like respect standing up to its full height. Dick was called forward. He moved with a quiet grace, the same way he always had, like a river that doesn't make noise until it meets a rock. As he took the plaque, simple, wooden, engraved with his name and 3 words beneath, "You gave anyway," his hands shook slightly, and he whispered under his breath, "Thank you," not to the mayor, not even to the crowd, but to every version of himself that kept showing up, even when it hurt. Micah watched from the front row, eyes wide with pride, and Grace dabbed her cheeks with a clean corner of her wrapper, not from sorrow, but because some victories taste like salt and sunshine. The moment was not loud, but it was lasting. It etched itself into memory like initials on the underside of a table, private, permanent, and full of meaning for those who knew where to look. The days that followed did not change Dick's routine. He still woke before dawn, still wiped his tools with care, still brewed his tea while the town blinked itself awake. But something within him had quietly shifted, like a latch unfastened after years of being jammed. He no longer carried the silence of his past like a wound. Instead, he wore it like a well-mended cloth, still visible in its scars, but clean and dignified. He accepted more teaching work now, guiding young men and women who had once been told they were too far gone to be shaped. He started something small, the Bench Project, a simple initiative where each student built a bench for someone they'd never met, to be placed in spots across Grayville where people often waited, bus stops, clinics, school gates. Let them sit in something made with kindness, he'd say, even if they never know your name. The benches began to appear all over town, silent ambassadors of healing. They were polished with care and sealed with the fingerprints of second chances. One even stood outside the hospital in Riverlane. Dick never returned to visit Josh again, but Leonard came one day, just walked into the shed like a man stepping into a memory. He didn't say much. Just helped Dick lift a heavy wardrobe onto a cart, wiped his forehead, and said, "I'm working now. Quiet job. Nothing fancy." Dick nodded. "Good," he said. And that was all. Sometimes, mending doesn't need words. It just needs presence. From that day, Leonard came every once in a while, always leaving something behind, a bag of nails, a roll of sandpaper, a loaf of bread. No explanations, no fanfare, just the steady rhythm of redemption, returning in tiny pieces. One evening, as dusk stretched its long fingers across the alley, and the smell of stew drifted through the air like a promise kept, Micah sat beside Dick outside the workshop, watching the bats make the jagged lines against the amber sky. The boy was now nearly a man, taller, stronger, his voice steadier, but his heart still tender in all the right places. "Uncle Dick," he said softly, "do you think people ever change?" Dick didn't answer right away. He reached for a splinter from the workbench, smoothed its edge with his thumb, then replied, "People don't always change, but they remember. And sometimes remembering is the beginning of change." Micah nodded, not as one who fully understood, but as one who trusted that understanding would arrive in time. They sat in silence after that, as the stars began to blink awake above them, quiet witnesses to all the things that had been lost, and all the things that had somehow found their way home. And as the night folded around them like a blanket, Dick leaned back against the wooden post, the same one he carved his first bench beside, and closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in rest. The world had taken from him, yes, but it had also returned something he never thought he'd see again, peace, carved not from forgetting, but from forgiving. And in that stillness, beneath the moonlight and the sound of children laughing somewhere beyond the fence, the man who once gave too much finally received something he never asked for, but always deserved. Sometimes life hands us a cross we didn't choose to carry, pain from those we called family, silence where love should have answered, and betrayal from hands we once fed. Like Dick, we may find ourselves emptying our plates so others can eat, only to watch them walk away with full bellies and hollow hearts. But listen closely. Goodness is never wasted. It may take the long road, but it finds its way back. Not always through the people we help, but through unexpected doors, new beginnings, and the quiet joy of peace that no one can steal. You don't have to harden your heart to heal. You can stay soft and still survive. You can forgive without forgetting. You can let go without becoming bitter. Some scars are not a sign of weakness. They're proof you survived what was meant to break you. And like Dick, you can rebuild from ashes, not by shouting your story, but by living it in a way that others find rest in your strength. Even if no one claps when you sacrifice, even if your kindness is mocked or misused, never stop being a place where peace can sit. One day, that very peace will sit with you, and you'll realize you didn't lose yourself. You found your truest form in the breaking. So don't rush to be understood. Don't chase closure like it owes you. Give when you can. Let go when you must. And above all, never let someone else's bitterness carve your spirit. For every listener who has given more than they received, who poured love into vessels that turned around and leaked, who held family on their shoulders only to be abandoned in their lowest hour, Lord, let this story remind them that their goodness was not in vain. Let them see that seeds sown in silence will one day bloom in places they never expected. Father, for hearts that were betrayed by their own blood, bring healing deeper than words. For those who feel invisible after giving everything, open doors of recognition that cannot be ignored. Let peace return to them in ways that make them say, "This can only be God." Strengthen every hand that still gives despite the hurt. Strengthen every soul that has chosen to forgive when revenge was easier. Turn their mourning into quiet laughter. Let their scars become maps that guide others home. May their stories, like Dick's, not end in pain, but in peace. May their kindness echo louder than the betrayal. May they rest, not because the world clapped, but because their spirit finally found stillness. And may the ones who wronged them see and know and change, even if from afar. This we pray, not in bitterness, not in brokenness, but in faith, that everything given in love will return multiplied. That healing is possible. That peace is still the reward of the quiet-hearted. In the name of the one who never forgets the forgotten. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.